Welcome to Revolutionize Your Retirement Radio, bringing you insights and strategies to help you create a magnificent and fulfilling second half of life. Here's your host, certified professional retirement coach and best-selling author, Dr. Dorian Mintzer.
I want to welcome you all to my fourth Tuesday Revolutionize Your Retirement Interview with Expert series. I'm Dorian Mintzer, owner of revolutionizeretirement.com. and the host for this series. Without further ado, I want to introduce Bruce Feiler, our guest, and I feel really honored. So the focus today will be on a book called The Search, and Bruce will be telling us all about it. Bruce Feiler is one of America's most thoughtful voices on contemporary life. He's the author of 7 New York Times bestsellers. His 3 TED Talks have been viewed more than 4 million times, and he teaches the TED course How to Master Life Transitions. His latest book, The Search, Finding Meaningful Work in a Post-Career World, is a bold new roadmap for finding meaning and purpose at work based on insights drawn from hundreds of life stories. He's employed a first-hand approach to his work. He's known for living the experiences he writes about. His work combines timeless wisdom and knowledge to allow people to live with more meaning, passion, and joy. For 2 decades, he's explored the intersections of families, relationships, and well-being. Bruce is a longtime columnist for the New York Times and writes the popular newsletter, The Nonlinear Life, about navigating life's ups and downs. He's contributed to The New Yorker, Parade, Gourmet, where he won 3 James Beards Awards. And he's also been the subject of a Jay Leno joke and a Jeopardy question. So maybe he'll tell us about that too. And his face appears on a postage stamp in the Grenadines. He's a native of Savannah, Georgia, and he lives in Brooklyn with his wife, Linda, and their identical twin daughters, who I hear are now 18 years old. And as I mentioned, I had the pleasure of interviewing Bruce when his book, Life is in the Transitions, came out, and I still recommend it so often to colleagues and clients. I really like your style, Bruce, and I've had the pleasure of reading sort of a draft of this book, The Search, Finding Meaningful Work in the Post-Career World. You have this really wonderful way of integrating history and facts with storytelling, of which you're just so well known about. So I really want to welcome you here and maybe start off with, tell us why you wrote this book.
First of all, thank you very much for inviting me, Dorian. Introduction, and I'm delighted to be here and to be part of this community, and greetings to everyone joining in this call or listening to a recording on podcast or wherever you're joining us from. For me, Dory, I would say that any big project, anything I'm going to devote multiple years of my life to, it begins with a feeling more than an idea. I'm the kind of person that sort of bounces back and forth between making decisions from my gut and from my head, and ultimately I need both. And in this case, it really was a feeling that that I felt stuck and confused and trying to think about what role work was going to play in my life. I'm, as you mentioned, in a life transition myself. In the next few weeks, as we tape this call, not only will I be publishing this new book, The Search, I will mark 15 years since a life-threatening cancer in my left leg that I don't know what to say, learned about or was diagnosed with 15 years ago. I'll mark 20 years of marriage, and then more or less in exactly 100 days from now, my wife and I are going to drop our only 2 children, our identical twin daughters, off to college. And so I feel... So the feeling is like, what do I want to be doing? What is most important to me? So that was the emotional feeling. And then the idea, like where my mind kicks in, is that everybody I know feels this in some way or another. That it just feels like the confluence of a whole series of circumstances that we all find ourselves in. The public health crisis, the idea of work from anywhere, the technological disruption, right? The commitment that we all have to living more meaningful, thoughtful lives built around being and not selling ourselves, our souls to work. Like all these things converged to make me feel like there was a change. And now that I've been working on this book for 3 years, the stakes are even more urgent. The numbers are staggering, Dory. 70% of Americans are unhappy with what they do. 3/4 of Americans, in a poll released just 2 weeks ago, said they plan to look for new work in the next 12 months. 50 million people quit a job in America in the last year. 50 million. That's a third of the workforce, and that's twice as many people who were quitting than 10 years ago. Another third of people are saying, I want to renegotiate, like where I work or how I work or when I work. So you add all those numbers up, that means 100 million Americans will sit down with someone tonight or tomorrow or this weekend and say, I'm not happy with what I'm doing and I want to do something else. This is the biggest kitchen table conversation in the world right now. And what I wanted to do was to do something to help. Like when I feel it and when I see it in the world around me, I want to help. And so in this case, I continue this work that I've been doing, as we talked about with Life is in the Transitions now for 6 years, crisscrossing the country, collecting stories, meeting actual people, like looking them in the eye and say, like, how are you navigating these challenges? And then what I do is I get a team of people and we code these stories and we analyze them and we look for patterns that can help all of us in times of change. So just to put this into some perspective, like a normal, say, academic paper in the field of narrative psychology, which kind of this work is related to, a normal academic paper will have 8, 10, 12 of these stories that people analyze and look for patterns in. I've done 400 now in the last 6 years. That's 1,500 hours of interviews and 10,000 pages of transcripts. It's insanely labor intensive, but what it does is it turns out to be really good at surfacing patterns and trends in real time. And so I knew about quiet quitting and the Great Resignation and this sort of moment. I almost could see it in real time being out in the field talking to people all day, every day. And so what I've tried to offer in the search is a roadmap for what you do when you find yourself stuck and confused and wanting something better, like I and so many other people feel.
And there's such richness because your stories, as I've been able to glean from your book, cover so many people in different ages, different walks of life, different demographics. It's part of that research that you do that kind of gives it so much clout. And those numbers that you mentioned are astounding when you really think about it. Maybe talk a little, if you would, because I know you do in this book and you did in the prior book, and it's so relevant, is the notion of life is not linear anymore, and that so many of the kind of old rules and old ways of thinking about life as well as work was a linear model. So maybe this might be a good place at the beginning to talk about your notion of the nonlinear life.
I think that's right. I think that if you take work in particular, I think that, and by the way, I was just looking at the numbers before we joined the conversation because we have people of different ages here in the conversation. Mm-hmm. There may be people who work with clients. I would say this book, the search, almost more than, this is my 15th book, almost more than anything I've written applies to a broad range of people because it applies to a lot of people who are 50 plus, right? 3/4 of people 50 plus are now working. Those are very, in some capacity, like that's a very big change from the past. It applies to millennials and Xers who are sort of 10, 15 years down the work path and say, I want to get off this path and go onto another. And it absolutely applies to new college grads and Gen Zers like my own kids who are realizing that what they learned from their parents isn't necessarily the life and the set of choices they're going to face. And so I think that people feel in work, say, I'm unhappy in my career. But it turns out the problem is not you. It's the idea of the career itself. And this gets to the heart of your question, right? So we have, certainly those of us of a certain age, we all grew up in this linear way of thinking about life, but that's a complete aberration. So in the ancient world, for example, they thought life was a cycle. because agriculture was a cycle and there was no linear time, right? There was no clock. And so people didn't think that way. It's actually the Hebrew Bible that introduces sort of the idea of the linear historical way of looking at the world. And in the Middle Ages, they think life is a staircase up to middle age and then down. And think about, and life is in the transitions. I have all these images. There's no starting over in 50 in that model. There's no new love at 60. There's no moving to Florida and opening a B&B or an Airbnb or whatever it is. It's like straight up and straight down. And this idea of a linear life really is, in effect, introduced with the rise of science in the 19th century. And, excuse me, I'm going to cough for a second. And in this model, suddenly, everything goes through stages. So you have Piaget talks about children in their stages, and Freud talks about the psychosexual stages, and Erickson's 8 stages of moral development, etc. These are all linear constructs, and these kind of reach their peak, if you will, in the 1970s with the idea of that everyone does the same thing in their 20s and then 30s, and everyone has a quote-unquote midlife crisis between 39 and 44 and a half. This turns out to be bunk. But everybody in this call at one time or another has probably heard people say, I'm in a midlife crisis. Just take the pandemic, for example, right? If you were between 39 and 44, you were in a quote-unquote midlife crisis. But if you were between 22 and 32, you were in a crisis, or 55 and 70, or in the case of my children, 15. So these things come at us whenever and wherever. And this turns out to be a particular problem in how we think about work. Okay, so for most of human history, for example, there was no word for career because there was no need for a word for career. People lived where they worked and worked where they lived. It wasn't until, again, the 19th century with the Industrial Revolution that for the first time, a third of Americans relocate from think about that, from rural areas to cities, okay? And then another tens of millions of people come from overseas. So suddenly you have all these people in cities, and they don't have anything to do, and there's a whole new set of jobs, and they don't have any people to do them. So a guy named Frank Parsons in Boston, who was a journeyman engineer and writer, he opens the first career counseling center in 1908, and within 2 years, every school in the country was offering career counseling. And what Parsons essentially introduces is the idea that you make a decision once in your life. In his case, he was only talking about boys anyway, not even girls. Right. But in your early 20s, you pick a quote-unquote career, and then you follow that track for the next 50 years. So this idea is only 100 years old. And then in the 50s, essentially after the war, when people started moving from factories to offices, another thing is invented, which we all think has been around forever, but it wasn't, which is the resume. There had never been a resume again. There was no need for a resume. But suddenly the resume, and what is the resume romanticized, maybe even fetishized from my point of view, the idea of a linear series of jobs, and each one is supposed to be higher and climbier on the ladder, and all these phrases, career ladder, career track, career path. These are all linear constructs. Some people do that today. Like some people set out to become doctors or astronauts or play center field for the New York Yankees, and they do it. But far more of us change our priorities, leave our jobs, make changes to adjust for family or health or our needs at any given time, one way or the other. And so we live in a world of a nonlinear way to approach work. And the blessing of that is that you can change work at any time for any reason. The burden is that you have to figure out what do you want to do and what are the things or the sources of meaning that you prioritize at any given moment. And that's what we haven't done. And so what I've tried to offer in the search is, as you said earlier, a roadmap, like a toolkit. I call it 21 questions to find work you love. A set of questions to ask yourself, or if anybody here is working with clients, to have your clients ask themselves, or your children, or your siblings, or your parents, a series of questions to say, what is the work I want now, which may be related to what I wanted when I was 22, or may be completely different. And so the question is, what do you want? What is it that gives you meaning today, and how can you go forth and achieve that?
So maybe you can share, there's so many different questions I have in my mind to ask you, but maybe since you've just mentioned the 21 questions, share with the listeners, if you would, some of the questions, because I know you like to think about it, and I love the fact that some have to do with the past and some of the present and some of the future. So can you give some examples of the kind of questions that would be helpful for people to think about?
So let's set the frame here. And the frame is that the predominant narrative of success that we've told in this country since the birth of this country is all about climbing up by your bootstraps, rags to riches, higher floor, bigger office, greater salary, more benefits. It's all about up. It's back to that linear upward trajectory, okay? But if there's one thing I learned in talking to hundreds of people about their lives, is that the people who are happiest and most fulfilled in what they don't just climb, they also dig. Okay, they do what I call a personal archaeology, right? They conduct a meaning audit, and they figure out who they are, what were the values that they inherited from their upbringings, what is it that they want today, and how can they do that in the future. I talked to this wonderful man named Mark Savickas, who is the dean of career counseling for the last 50 years, and he told me that we all have this sort of unknown known in our lives, this story that we've been trying to tell entire lives that we put aside for one reason or another because it's not what our parents wanted us to do, or it's not going to get us the money that we seek, or it's not going to get us whatever it is that we think we want at any particular moment. But it's still there, right? Anybody on our call who is in the world of counseling and psychology and therapy and all these things know that we all have these stories. But for whatever reason, and I don't really know the answer to this, but for whatever reason, the idea that your life is a story, which has gone from the fringe of psychology in the 1980s to the heart of psychology today, because we now know that our brains are wired to tell stories. For whatever reason, this idea of story has never really been applied to work. Okay, the idea of a work story somehow seems outside the mainstream, and yet it should be the mainstream. And I think younger workers are making that happen. The essence of these 21 questions, the essence of the meaning audit is to tell a story. And we know the difference between happiness and meaning is that happiness is fleeting. It's an emotion. It's something you feel right now. Whereas meaning stitches together past, present, and future. So the nature, if you want to find out what is your story of meaning and work, you got to go back to the past. I'll just do a couple of. Let's just start with the who. So these questions are divided into who, what, when, where, why, and how. The basic questions of how to build a story. So let's just start with a simple one. What were the values? I'm going to ask you. So Dori, tell me, what were the upsides of work you learned from your parents?
I learned you work hard, you give back, you are respectful. That I think I learned early about money because I started picking dandelions for people and started earning money when I was 5. So there was something about that.
You're picking dandelions that grow free and flipping into money? Wow, that's a skill.
I think it was
Okay, so now let me flip that and ask you this. So what were the downsides?
Back in my generation, there weren't a lot of things that girls necessarily, in my case, were encouraged to do. And I even had a teacher in 8th grade who, because I loved science then, said, don't be smart, you won't get a husband. Back then, I didn't allow myself to have too many dreams. I was going to be the helpmate of somebody else. And luckily, society changed, I changed, my story changed, I let myself change it. But I really felt like the messages back then, there were always exceptions, and my mother had a degree and didn't work though till I was 16, but the emphasis for girls was the work world isn't number one for you, that it's just maybe something you'll be involved in or maybe not. I think it's very different for boys, and I think it's really different now for men and women and whomever.
This is beautiful, and now you begin to see, right? Ask these questions, okay? The first thing you said you learned from your parents was hard work, okay? Mm-hmm. When I ask people, when I coded the answers, 67% of the people, 2/3 of people say that the number one lesson they learned from their parents is work, hard work. But then when you turn to the downside, so you talked about the fact that you couldn't be smart. You were a helpmate or a helpmeet actually is what that of course comes from Eve in the Adam and Eve story, and the helpmeet is the King James translation. And what's interesting about that, and what jumps out to me, is you like the idea of helping, okay, but you were told that you could only help your spouse, and it turns out that you flipped that and you want to help people beyond your own family. Because if you look at the prominent downsides people say about their work, they're bunched together. Each is about a third, and those three are overwork, like people work too hard and you neglected the family. The second is strain on the family, right? People sacrificed time with loved ones for time in the workplace. And the third is that they were unhappy. You alluded to that a little bit with your mother. She prioritized the family. Maybe she wasn't unhappy, but for you, happiness meant using your skills not just in your family, but also to help others, and in some cases even other families. Okay, think how rich this is, Dory. We're 2 minutes into this conversation. We're only in the first question of the 21 questions, and it turns out that you have all this color and ambiance and angels and ghosts that are haunting your work story. That's not how we talk about work. When we talk about finding work you love, it's beef up your resume and call your contacts distant and close. We're only talking about how to find work, and we're never talking about the deeper questions, who you want to be and what you want to do and why you want to do it and where you want to do it and when you want to do it. We should put how much later in the process, and we should put ourselves. And so just everyone listening, or if you're helping people who want to be happy in what they do, here's a simple question, right? I want to be the kind of person who. So let me ask you, Dory, at this moment in your life, not 2 years ago or 10 years ago, at this moment in your life, answer this question. I want to be the type of person who blank.
I want to be the type of person who helps people reach their potential and figures out what they want, how they want to be and what they want to do, so that they have a sense of agency and a sense of well-being and happiness. Not the fleeting kind of happiness, but the well-being happiness. And that energizes me to really help people individually or groups, workshops, my speaking and my writing, just really wanting to help people dig deep, as you say, and not just deal with the numbers, but really figuring out what gives purpose and meaning and connection and engagement to life.
And if we went deeper into this conversation, that was beautiful, by the way, thank you. But if we went deeper and we went at different moments of your life, I bet you might have answered that question in a different way at different times. So at one point it might have been, I want to be the type of person who prioritizes my young children, or who gives me time to be with an aging parent. And so maybe or has a kid in travel soccer and wants to be that parent who can be present on the weekends and therefore doesn't want a job that is 12 hours a day or requires traveling 2 weeks a month. Or maybe in my case, you want to be the type of person who can provide for your family. And now I'm about to send 2 kids to college. Trust me, I know what that means in different ways, because it's more time in my life, but it also means an outlay of resources and family treasure. So the point is, in the old days, right, back to the linear model of work that we've been talking about, you got on the escalator and you couldn't get off the escalator. But in fact, you can get off the escalator and you can make a choice now, and it could be a different choice, right? The heart of the search is looking at these moments. I call them work quakes, right? And because some are voluntary, like having a family or starting an organization or starting a private practice in some way. Some are involuntary, or a recession or a pandemic, or maybe you get laid off from your job. Some are personal, like it's happening in your personal life, and some are because something happens in the workplace. The average person goes through 20 work quakes in their lives. 20. That's one every 2.5 years. Okay? And what this means is, and by the way, I think the signature piece of data from the search is that more than half of all work quakes, 55%, begin not with work, not a conflict with the boss or renegotiating your job or leaving a company or starting a nonprofit or whatever it might be. That's 45% of them. 55% of them happen in our personal lives. Something happens with our families or our health, or just frankly between our ears. Our mindset changes and we want to do something else. So that means in the battle between work and life, like the worst thing you can do is separate those two and try to balance them. Actually, the people who are happiest integrate them, and they figure out where they are in their life, and they do work that fits where they are, rather than make their life fit their work.
I think that's such an important point, and I think I even could look back over my parents' generation as well as my own life and people around me of being able to be flexible and recognize that nonlinear part and make those changes so that there can be more, really, I think, fulfillment. I was thinking as you were talking, I've always felt like I lived the nonlinear life. I always used to call it backwards, but I like your concept of nonlinear more than I do everything backwards. But I didn't become a mom until I was 50. And so I had my career established and I was able to cut back, just as you're saying, so I could be the mom I wanted to be, but I also knew I wanted to work. And just you have a big section in the book where you talk about how so much had been just on the numbers, how much you earn, and the shift really is the meaning aspect. And I think in the encore years too, many people say, I did what I had to do to provide for my family, but now I want to do what I want to do.
I think that's right, and I think that's what happened in these various transitions that we go through, is that we recalibrate and reanalyze what is it that brings us meaning and say, okay, as you said, maybe I was all about agency or building something or working because I needed salary and benefits and to provide for my family or whatever it might be. And we know a lot of people in the encore years or even 50 plus who say, okay, I did that for a while and now I want to do something else that's more about, say, belonging or like being part of a community or public service or community or whatever gives me purpose. And I think that it's important to know, my book the search is built around what I call the 3 lies and a truth about work. And the 3 lies are you have a career. We've discussed that. You can get on and off whenever you want. The second is that you have a path, and there is no path, right? So you can make your own path. You can double back. And a lot of people, by the way, say I want to just pause for a second and talk about what you said about what you meant by backwards, because what you felt was that, and what people say, and everybody says this at one time or another, is that they feel like they're off track or off kilter, or like the life they're living is not the life they expected to live. The problem is not your life. The problem is the expectations, right? You talked about becoming a mom at 50. I got cancer at 43 when I was a new dad of 3-year-old identical twins. That's not supposed to happen. But you're supposed to get sick later in life. But guess what? A third of us are going to get cancer, and we're going to get it all through our lives. So the problem is, when you say backwards, it's because we've stigmatized these ideas of doing things in non-traditional ways. And what basically people under 40 are saying is, enough of that. So 6 out of 10 millennials say that being at work is more important to them than to their parents. Okay? The number one thing that millennials and Gen Z say that they want out of work, okay, is well-being. Okay? The money comes in third, and 6 of the top 7 on the list has to do with meaning or flexibility, as you said, or purpose. This is a generational shift that's going on, and ironically, it makes a lot of us, say 50 plus, feel confused and stuck and unsure what to do, because our children are saying things like, and we're saying to our children, wait, you're moving to a new town and you don't know what you're going to do, right? Or you're quitting one job and you don't have another one lined up. But I think that what's happening is those of us of a certain generation reckon with the world of fluidity and flexibility that we see around us. It's actually boomeranging, and we now are embracing it and saying, if it works for them, why can't it work for me? It's harder for us, but I think it gives us a lot of opportunity to live a life that's more defined on our own terms.
That's absolutely true. And I think I think all of us in my generation, or even somewhat younger, but I do see the same thing in my son, of really trying to figure out that combination of how do I find a path that will give me opportunities to make changes, to have maybe a portfolio kind of life, and to find meaning and purpose in life. I think it is so important.
Let's talk about the portfolio, because I think that's another thing that I saw. Because the third lie that we haven't mentioned here is that you have a job, right? And I think that this turns out to be, on the surface, it seems the most absurd. Of course I have a job, right? How do I pay my bills? But when you dig down, actually, it's even more surprising, because no one has just one job anymore. The people have multiple jobs, right? There's what we might call a main job, but by some measures, only half of us even have a main job anymore. a lot of us have caring jobs, which often is not paid, but involves caring for children or aging relatives. 3/4 of us have a side job, but then 86% of us have what I call a hope job, which is work that we're doing that we often don't get paid for, that we hope leads to something else, like writing a screenplay or selling pickles at the farmer's market or jewelry on Etsy or whatever it might be. And I think that while on the surface that sounds like a lot of jobs, in fact what we do is what's non-negotiable is that we want meaning in our work. And so what we do is that we say, okay, I'm doing the main job for salary and benefits, but I'm doing this side job because it gives me meaning. And then oftentimes we'll flip, and then maybe we'll commit more to the side job, or this is how a lot of entrepreneurs begin, is they're doing something on the side, and then it takes off. But while you may not still be making money, maybe you then have to take a side job to make money while your main job is building. And so there's a kind of flexibility in how we approach it that is a great opportunity. But sometimes it feels like a burden because, in effect, we get writer's block trying to write the story of our own work lives, which is why sort of the heart of what I'm trying to do here is give people like your son, give people like you when you became a new parent at 50, or people going through retirement, or anybody who's now got young children and suddenly the priorities have been rejiggered and you don't know what to do, to give them a set of tools to identify what's the decision that they should make right now.
Mm-hmm. And where does, in your looking at it, you mentioned the hope job, which is maybe doing something that will lead to something else. But what about just volunteering and wanting to give back? Sort of the 60s mentality that I grew up with is we're part of this larger whole and we need to do things to make it right and give back. Do you find that sort of the way people do volunteer work, is that considered the caring?
I do think that is a job. I do think that serving the co-op board or being on the volunteer committee at the religious institution, or I do think that in the language of contemporary life, that feels like work, right? In the way that, if you look at the way modern couples negotiate this, right? Okay, so you take bath time and I'll take bedtime. That's one of the ways we used to divide it. My wife, we have 18-year-olds. She still can't get them to sleep, right? So I'm the bedtime guy. But then I'm a late night person, and so her job is breakfast and my job is bedtime. Right? So I think that the language of work really has taken over in a way that a lot of people bemoan. But I think if there's an upside to it, it's that we view these things as different types of work that can bring us the meaning. But let's remember that sense of giving back. I sat here, I'm at my home in Brooklyn as we have this conversation, and at my desk recently, I ran the numbers. They're very telling. Dorian, there are 5 million people involved in education from kindergarten to college. There's 6 million people involved in the arts. There's 10 million people involved in public service, security or national security. There's 20 million people involved in government service. If you add this up, that's 50 million people. That's a third of the workforce of people who are doing work that has some degree of self-expression or service or community or giving back as part of it. The idea that everybody is like just doing the thing for the highest salary, that isn't really a reflection of how people make their decisions. And there's research. There's a passage in my book. There's a moment in my book where I ask people, tell me about the biggest work quake you went through. And do you feel like it was a step forward, a lateral step, or a step backwards? 90%, said a step forward. 10% lateral, nobody said a step backwards. Then I said to them, did you make more money, less money, or the same amount of money? And 50% made less money. 41% made more money. 9% made the same amount of money. That means if you look at it a different way, 6 out of 10 people in their biggest moment of kind of work inflection, they made the same or less amount of money. And on the surface, that would appear to go against centuries of conventional wisdom. But I'm not the only one. Sean Achor of Harvard published a study that showed people are willing to give up as much as a third of their life earnings if their work feels more meaningful to them. So there really is a change, and I think the big way to capture that change is that fewer people are searching merely for work, and more people are searching for work with meaning. This meaning thing is just absolutely central. And the question is, how do you define meaning? And, of course, what I do in the search is give you a way to determine what that meaning is for you at any particular moment in your life.
Yeah, and the stories that you have in the book are just phenomenal about that. So you mentioned, and I want to just have you expand a little bit more, that we all have sort of 5 jobs: the main job, the caring job, the side job, the hope job. You didn't mention the ghost job, but I know you. So can maybe talk a little about what the ghost job is? You come up with wonderful concepts. So
I would say the 3 or 4 things. The book is just coming out, and I'm hearing from lots of people who are reading it and encountering it, and I'm certainly grateful for this chance to talk about it and look forward. I would love to hear from people, and I'm easy to find in social media and my website, and you mentioned my newsletter, the Nonlinear Life on Substack, and I love hearing from readers. This is the number one thing that I hear about, is this idea of what I call a ghost job. And I have to tell you, I was just sitting doing these interviews, right? I've done 1,500 hours of collecting these life stories, and I just kept hearing everybody had something that haunted them, for lack of a better word, right? It was this, this is maybe not the most technical term, but it's what it is. It's like an invisible time suck that just grates at us and gnaws at us and haunts us. And so it took me a long time to come up with this word, this phrase, this idea of ghost job. But so what are these ghost jobs? These ghost jobs are battling self-doubt or imposter syndrome. My book opens with this amazing story of Isaiah Warner, who grows up picking cotton in a tiny town in Louisiana. And he said when he was picking cotton, that cotton was his mentor, because it was like, you don't want to be in the field. And he's interested in chemistry, and he wins a scholarship to an HBCU in Louisiana. And he goes on to become one of the most decorated chemists in America, with dozens and dozens of published articles. Before he went to LSU as a named professor, they had given 4 PhDs to black students. He alone has given 100. And he said to me, I always felt unworthy. I always felt somebody would find out my background. They would learn that I didn't grow up going to a good school. He went to a school that was a segregated school in the Deep South, where the white schools got the textbooks, he told me, and when they were done with them and they became outdated in 6 years, then they sent them to the black schools. And those were the textbooks that he learned, and now he's a PhD in chemistry. And what does he do? What is his? Oh, you may be hearing some beeping outside my window with the horns, but what is his care job? What is really important to him? Being a mentor, the mentor that he didn't have when he was picking cotton in the field as a young boy. But what is his ghost job? It's self-doubt. This is an astonishing thing, and everybody has one. Battling self-doubt, discrimination, bigotry, worrying about money, financial wellness. If I didn't grow up in a family where I was taught how to spend or how to save or how to think about money. And there's just a lot of people who struggle with learning basic financial literacy. And when I ask people how much time their ghost jobs take, they said on average 12 hours a week that they spend not being productive, but worrying. And this gets to the thing that you brought up that we didn't talk about, which is I think the way to think about work is that work is a formula. Right, an equation, maybe a better way of putting it. Work equals numbers plus words. And the numbers are what we normally talk about. Money, salary, benefits, hours, productivity, efficiency. But when I ask people, tell me, what's the first word that comes to – I'll ask you, Dory, what's the first word that comes to your mind when I say work?
For me, it's enjoying. Really enjoying helping people grow.
Only 1/3 of people mentioned what they do, right? Therapist, podcast host, union worker, carpenter, teacher, advisor, baseball player. You get the point. 2/3 of people said how they feel about what they do, which is exactly what you said, enjoyment. Well, the problem that we have with work is we spend far too much time talking about numbers and not enough time talking about words. Too much math, not enough literature, right? And I think that's the change that's going on, because one thing that is consistent over time, certainly in the American kind of way of thinking about work, is that people want to do better than their parents. And you and I grew up at a time when doing better than your parents meant making more money, living in a nicer house, driving a fancier car. But that's really hard now for a whole bunch of reasons, real estate escalation, just the sort of general trends in the economy. So the way millennials, Gen Z, younger workers, which of course now are predominant female, more diverse, the way they want to be better than their parents is quality of life.
Right.
And that's the big change, is that people are not prepared to sacrifice well-being. They're not going to sell themselves to a job. If it somehow conflicts, that's why 50 million people, a third of the workforce, have quit a job in the last year, because the terms are changing and the workers have much more influence over how they live their lives and in finding the jobs and the work that they want.
I think that's so true. And just seeing how, I think you mentioned the statistics in your book too, of that younger people just move more quickly from sometimes even project to project and don't even conceive of kind of that long-term kind of thing. But so there's a question from Elizabeth from Minnesota who says, and it ties into kind of another part that I hope you'll talk about. She says, what's the number one thing a person must do in order to find meaning and rewarding work? And I think that relates to maybe going a little bit more into the digging and what you call the meaning audit. So maybe you could talk a little more about that.
The number one thing someone needs to do is to stop chasing someone else's dream and start changing their own. Stop chasing someone else's dream and start chasing their own. And therefore, the most important part of that is identifying what is your dream, okay? And what is it that brings you meaning? That's the don't climb, dig. You have to do the work. Okay, these are people who are infused in the language of therapy. You have to do the work to find the work, and it's the doing the work that we skip. Okay, and so let's just take another set of questions. The what we talked about. So my book divides these 21 questions into the who, what, when, where, why, and how. So we talked a little bit about the who, your parents, right? And now let's talk a little bit about the what, right? And so one question to ask yourself is, other than family, who was your role model as a child, okay? And so let me just quickly ask you. So other than, because I know we want to get to some questions because we got a giveaway here. Just tell me quickly, Dory, so who was your role model as a child?
My teachers, really. Yeah, my teachers were role models more than my parents, although later I actually began to recognize my parents a little bit as role models. But then as I got older, I have one wonderful role model of a woman who's 91 who got her PhD at 69. Many people on the call know her, Jan Hively. And her mantra is meaningful work, paid or unpaid, through one's last breath. But I like the way she lives her life and the way she has created programs that have outlived her being involved in them. I mean, that's a beautiful thing.
And so what we're talking about here is trying to figure out what you want to do, right? That's the question on the table. And so what we're now is in the what, okay? So your role model as a child is very valuable, not because of who the role model is. Some people pick teachers, other adults like teachers or coaches. A lot of people pick celebrities or somebody, this woman who was a basketball player, she told me that her model was Michael Jordan because of his work ethic. And she had a child with a brain disorder, and then she went and developed a CBD treatment for her child. And it was all about hard work, right? And dedication on and off the field. Essentially, your childhood role model, we inherit we don't pick our parents. We just inherit those values, right? But our role model we choose. So if you want to know, for example, what you should be doing now, start by asking yourself what you wanted to be doing when you were a child. And again, it's not who the role model is, it's what values you admired in them, okay? And then that leads to a question of, I want to do work right now that. There's one of your fill-in-the-blank questions. That then allows you to say, I want to do work that brings me meaning, brings me money, allows me to travel, gives me the freedom to spend time with my family, can make the world a better place. What all of these questions are doing is doing the exercise that the question that we're answering now is of how to find the meaningful work. I think the meaning and happiness and well-being, that's something everybody here has heard a lot. I think what's new in the search is the tools, the things that you can actually do to achieve it.
Can you talk a little bit more about that, of how you would, let me shift it a little to you, if you don't mind, because you talk about the impact of work in your life and how you were able to really go your own direction and your own way, but how hard it was. I personally think that's a wonderful story to share with people if you're willing.
I grew up in a family business in Savannah, Georgia. Every Saturday of my childhood, I had to get dressed up, not a coat and tie, but blue corduroys and a white button-down shirt is really what I wore. And I would go out the back door of my house, a sliding glass door, and go to my grandparents' house, who lived immediately behind us, seen out of Faulkner. And my grandmother would make breakfast on a Saturday morning. It was like one scrambled egg, hand-cut French fries, which I can taste this very second, and one Krispy Kreme donut. This was the South, which she kept frozen, and then she would zap in this new creature called a microwave for 9 seconds. And then I would get in the car with my grandfather, and he would drive 6 miles an hour down Habersham Street in Savannah, Georgia, to this one-story cinder block office. And I would sit behind a desk, and my family built low-income housing and apartments, and for people who was sort of an entryway into the world of shelter. And I would take rent payments, $18 to $16, $22. And I used to have to write in the ledger, and I look them in the eye, shake their hand, ask about their family. And my grandfather, in his bow tie and suit and polished Oxfords, would look over my shoulder and put his hand on my back and brag about my penmanship and good grades. And I was expected to follow this path. You can't have imagined a more linear. My grandfather liked trains and cars and industrial things and hair tonic and masculinity. It was all of that. But a month before I graduated from high school, as it happened 40 years ago this month, now that I'm telling the story, my grandfather got sick, and all he knew was work. The most important thing was work, not family, not love, not relationships, not community, work. And when he got sick and he couldn't work anymore, he took a pistol and took his own life. And for me, that experience became a kind of searing memory for not to get trapped in that, because there was another place in that office that's who I wanted to be, where my father had a file where he would keep the short stories that I would write and the poems that I would write and the letters. And when I went back after my father's death a few years ago and found this file, who writes 12-page letters home from summer camp? I did. And so my life was about this tension, and I thought that this tension was unique to me, that I had the expected life that I would live, and yet the life I wanted to live, and they were in tension. And I never wrote. I wrote 15 books, and I write about things. I've written about spirituality. I've written about family. I've written about happiness. I've written about health challenges with the Council of Dads when I got cancer. And I never wrote about work, but because I thought that there was a different world. But what's happened, Dory, in my life is that work has come toward me. My wife likes to say that I have hard knowledge about soft things. And the world has gone soft now. We all want soft things like being and meaning and purpose and happiness. Right. And that's why I was able to write this, because now is the opportunity that we don't have to closet off work from the things that are most important to who we are. We can bring that into the world of work. And that's the great opportunity of the moment we live in.
That's why I wanted you to share that story, because I really think that's another part that's so influential. It's almost like letting yourself come full circle for yourself, being able to find that meaning and turn many life quakes that you had into that, having a work quake of deciding what's really important to you, and here you are. So I think it's so helpful for people to hear. Katie from Ontario says, how do we help younger people focus their role aspirations onto a right path when the schools seem to direct them to set paths that focus on these established linear kinds of jobs?
I actually love this question, and I think I want to answer the question, but let me first say it's not just the schools, right? Parents, right. Society, there's a lot of external forces, but I entirely agree that the education, I don't know what you might want to call it, the career industrial complex or something, there's a lot of careerism, right? And the schools are doing this, by the way. I've just been through the college application death march with my own children, so I'm just deep in this world, and my own children, as I said earlier, are going to start college 100 days from now. And one of the reasons is just remember that the colleges and universities and schools and even high schools for people who are not going to go down the college path are doing this is because the parents are putting this pressure on them, right? This idea of return on investment, college has become so much more expensive, et cetera. So that is happening, and I think that what we need, the first thing to do is to normalize the nonlinear work life, okay? Even if you start off on that path, you're going to be on a different path. 20 times, to echo what I said earlier, 20 times in your life, you're going to face a moment of indecision and inflection around your work. So there is no path. You can set off down a career, down a track and down a world, but it's going to change. Just look at the AI, right? AI, we focus a lot on all the jobs that may be lost to AI, but 3 times the amount are going to be created by AI. That's what technology has done. Right? There's some studies out there that say a third of us are going to be in jobs that haven't even been invented yet, if you're that young. So I would relax the burden to make one choice and normalize the idea that you're going to face multiple choices in your life, and therefore make sure that you don't put how first. Don't put the how to find a job first. Put the other questions. Put the who, what, when, where, and why before you put the how. And that, I think, is the big lesson that those of us with a little more experience can help the young people. What matters is how you make the decision, who you want to be, what you're doing, where you want to do it, and most especially why you want to do it. I tell one story to wrap up here. I tell a story of Mary Robinson. She lost her father when she was 11, and she was not allowed, because that was not allowed in where she grew up at that time, to mourn properly. It was like buckle up, stiff upper lip, and move on. She had a lot of drinking in her life. She had a lot of wandering in her life. She had a lot of different work roles in her life, and she ends up at a Fortune 50 company working for Prudential. And she goes home one day, and she has a conflict with her mother, and she goes up to her childhood bedroom, and she finds a book in the bed, and in reading this book, she's taken back and realized that she has this pain, her toothache, as I call it, that's been nagging at her. Mm-hmm. And she walks away from Prudential and an established traditional success metric kind of employment, and she goes to work for an organization and later starts her own organization that helps children and families grieve, because she finally found her why. And that's the thing to tell young people. It's not the how. That's the easy part. It's the why. It's the who. It's the what. It's the where. Ask these 21 questions to find work you love, and you will find the happiness you seek, the meaning you crave, and the success you deserve on your own terms.
That sounds like a really great place to stop. Let me just ask one quick question from Darla, which is, how often do you recommend revisiting those questions?
What's interesting, I was doing an interview before this, Dorian, someone asked me, what happens if you're going through a difficult time, or you have a health crisis, or there's a recession? And I was like, in some ways, that's the time to do the work, to find the work, so that when you're coming out and looking for work again, you've done the meaning audit, and you're ready to make the right choices. I think that the answer to the question is as often as you need. I feel like what I know for a fact is that, because I run the numbers, we're going to face 20 of these moments in our lives. That's on average every 2.85 years. But by the way, women do them more than men, Xers more than boomers, and millennials more than Xers. So when the average millennial will go through 2/3 more of these than will a boomer. So I think the issue is there's not a right answer to how many times. It's whenever you feel you need to is the answer, and you shouldn't feel ashamed or embarrassed or worried. If you feel uncomfortable in your career, the problem is not you. It's your notion of the career. You can change whatever you do for whatever reason, even something as simple as you just want to.
That's great. And Bruce, can you tell people again just how to get onto your newsletter and the book and pre-ordering and all of that?
First of all, thank you again, Dory, for this community, for this beautiful, just the tone of this conversation has been so rich, and I know that's why everyone keeps coming back, and I'm delighted to be a part of this community. My new book is called The Search, Finding Meaningful Work in a Post-Career World. You can order it or pre-order it wherever you get your books. There's an ebook. I personally recorded the audio book, and it's just an amazing reception because everybody feels this pain, and it would mean a lot to me if you would order it and share it with people you or someone you know is in a work quake, and I hope it helps a lot of conversations. You can follow me on any social channel, LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, at Bruce Feiler. That's Feiler. I do write about this weekly in my newsletter called The Nonlinear Life, which is at brucefeiler.substack.com. And at any time you can go to brucefeiler.com, reach out to me, and let's keep the conversation alive. We will get through this time if we do it together.
Thank you so much. Any last word you want to share?
you deserve to be happy in what you do. And those around you do
Good.
too. If you're happy in what you do, count your blessings and reach out to someone else who's unhappy and help them get, as I said, the happiness they seek and the meaning that they crave and the success they deserve.
Great. Thank you so much for taking this time to be with us today. And as I said, your book, it's terrific. I really hope that I'm sure it's going to do really well, as your other books have too. And thank you so much for being with us at the start of your wonderful launch so that we can be part of it too. So thank you. Take care.
Thank you very much.
You've been listening to Revolutionize Your Retirement Radio with Dr. Dorian Mintzer. To learn more about the resources mentioned on today's show, listen to past episodes, or download our free retirement transition guide, visit revolutionizeyourretirementradio.com.